Thank you for joining us for this panel presentation titled The Importance of Identifying English Learners in Education Research Studies. My name is Dory LaForette, and I'm joined by Lisa Lopez, Matthew Foster, Leslie Babinski, Steve Amendum, Jimena Franco, and Adam Winsler to share information from 3 IES projects focused on English learners, or ELs, and discuss best practices in identifying this growing population of students. We are also joined by Molly Faulkner-Bond, who will serve as the discussant for the panel and share her thoughts about the presentation as a group. Before we go into the individual presentations, we want to start with a brief overview of the EL population, the methods used by researchers and school systems to identify ELs, and the implications of using these methods. Consistent with the meeting theme centered on advancing equity and inclusion, we argue that attention to the methods used to identify ELs is of critical importance for ensuring valid research and appropriate practice and policy efforts that promote equity for ELs, regardless of whether researchers' primary focus is centered on ELs. After this brief overview, we'll move into the panel presentations, followed by the discussant comments and Q&A. Let's first do a quick overview of ELs in U.S. schools. Who are English learners? The Every Student Succeeds Act has a detailed definition of who is considered an English learner. In short, the individual must be between the ages of 3 and 21 years and is enrolled in or preparing to enroll in elementary or secondary school. Also, the individual's English language proficiency must affect their ability to meet state academic standards, achieve in classrooms where instruction is in English, or participate in society. ESSA provides several details regarding English language proficiency, such as whether or not the individual was born in the United States, has a native language other than English, is of Native American or Alaska Native background, comes from areas where English is not the dominant language or is migratory. In terms of how many ELs are in U.S. schools, the most recent data from the National Center of Education Statistics in 2018 showed that 10% of K-12 students in U.S. public schools were ELs. This is about 5 million students, and the percentages at the state level range from 1 to 20%. There are 10 states whose EL population exceeds 10%, and those are Alaska, California, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Washington State. So as you can see, most of these states are in the western part of the United States, and the southwestern US has 3 states where the percentage of EL students exceeds 15%, and those are California, New Mexico, and Texas. Home language surveys, which are completed by a parent or guardian, are the primary and initial mechanism used to identify ELs. When administered by school personnel, the 3 questions approved by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, and the U.S. Department of Judgment are: number 1, what is the primary language used in the home, regardless of the language spoken by the student? Number 2, what is the language most often spoken by the student? And number 3, what is the language that the student first acquired? Additionally, education agencies are required under the law to test a student whose parent or guardian responded to 1 or more of these questions, indicating a language other than English. Researchers may also use home language surveys as well as assessment methods to determine whether students in their sample are ELs. In research, there are several challenges in identifying ELs. First, there needs to be intentionality in identifying who are the ELs. The population data on ELs suggests the likelihood of ELs being in education research study samples is high, even if ELs are not the focus of the study. Lack of attention to identifying who ELs are in education research studies is a problem. When researchers do prioritize identifying ELs in their samples, there can be real barriers that interfere with their efforts. These include resource limitations, such as staff who are proficient in the languages of the sample, or the existence of valid and appropriate language screening measures. This is especially true for languages other than Spanish. Even if researchers limit their identification efforts to home language surveys or rely on methods used by education agencies, there is a risk that the information obtained may be limited, incomplete, or inaccurate. And as such, the method used may interfere with being able to accurately identify ELs in ways that are nuanced enough to conduct sophisticated and meaningful analyses on ELs in the sample or interpret the findings. As you listen to these presentations, we would like you to be thinking about the consequences for education research when there is inadequate or incorrect identification of ELs in research studies, especially given our goal of having research affect practice and policy that meaningfully enhance students' learning and educational outcomes. Specifically, when researchers do not identify ELs in their studies or use inaccurate or imprecise methods, this creates limits on getting an accurate description of the sample studied, because we might not know how many ELs are in the sample or if they were correctly identified. And while in some instances, researchers may indeed report on the number of ELs in the sample, it's also important to disclose how it was determined that the students were ELs. If this information is not provided, it can limit opportunities for other researchers to replicate the study. And then finally, when a study gives limited information on ELs in the sample, it becomes difficult to evaluate whether the methods used in the study, such as the measures used, were appropriate for ELs. Further, it can be a challenge to figure out if the findings are valid for ELs and relevant for the practices and policies derived from the research that might be applied to them. So in total, a key message we want to convey is that equity in education for ELs is significantly undermined when ELs remain hidden or unacknowledged in research studies. Ultimately, this practice reduces opportunities for researchers to produce meaningful and relevant findings to support practices and policies that benefit ELs. We'll elaborate on these issues in the 3 presentations in today's session. So presentation 1 will have Drs. Lisa Lopez and Matthew Foster from the University of South Florida, and their IES project type is an exploration study using secondary data analysis. Their best practice focus is using nuanced approaches to identify within group variation among ELs versus using homogeneous grouping methods. The second presentation is our Drs. Leslie Babinski and Stephen Mendham from Duke University and University of Delaware, and their project type is an efficacy study. Their best practice focus is within group variation among ELs in the study of teacher professional development. And for presentation 3, with my colleagues Simona Franco and Adam Winsler, we're from UNC Chapel Hill and George Mason University. We'll be sharing data from our exploration study, where we are doing original data collection, and our best practice focus is on EL misclassification risks when using home language surveys. And our discussant will be Dr. Molly Faulkner-Bond from West Ed. And now on to the presentations. We look forward to chatting with you during the Q&A.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Lisa Lopez, and together with my colleague, Dr. Matthew Foster, we will be presenting today on examining within group variability among English learners in preschool settings. We currently have an IES Exploration Secondary Data Analysis grant, along with Dr. Karen Nyland Gibson. Today, we will be presenting some preliminary data from that project. As just mentioned, the research reported here is supported by IES. However, the opinions being expressed are those of the authors and do not represent the view of IES. I wanted to start by providing some clarifying points on terminology. For the overall panel, we are using ELs, a term that has been adopted by IES. However, I need to make a distinction here because the sample we're reporting on is in preschool, specifically Head Start, and have a home language other than English and are learning both languages at the same time. We are therefore using the term DLL for the current presentation. DLLs comprise approximately a quarter of the preschool population in the United States. In this presentation, we're focusing on the linguistic diversity of dual language learners. We know that DLLs come from linguistically diverse homes, with over 400 languages spoken by children enrolled in Head Start programs in the US. Spanish, however, is the most prevalent of the languages reported, with over 75% of DLLs speaking Spanish as one of their home languages. Although the majority of DLLs in the US are Spanish speakers, there is still large variability regarding English proficiency, as well as Spanish proficiency among this group. The rationale for this diversity is based on the variability of language inputs received. We know children learn language through exposure to the language. DLLs may have varying language experiences both at home and in the preschool classroom. DLLs often live in multi-generational homes and may be exposed to multiple languages with different patterns of language exposure at home. The same is true for language exposure in the preschool classroom. There is some level of linguistic diversity in preschool classrooms, such that children may be in classrooms in which multiple languages are spoken. Considering home language inputs, for example, my colleagues and I analyzed the varying language experiences Latinx preschool DLL children experience at home by surveying 448 Latinx caregivers on language use patterns at home. Approximately 80% of parents reported speaking to each other in all or mostly Spanish, with greater language variability represented between the adults and the child. In fact, in almost half of the homes, the caregivers reported some combination of English and Spanish being spoken within the parent-child triad. While the linguistic diversity is often less prevalent in the classroom, it is still present. DLL children are typically in the classroom with other DLL peers, and some classrooms are set up with dual language models. My colleagues and I have found that DLL children typically spend more time speaking with peers than with teachers in the classroom. Furthermore, even though Spanish-speaking teachers may be speaking predominantly in English during instructional time, there are times throughout the day when the teachers speak to DLLs in their home language, primarily with regard to giving directions and organizational tasks, such that students are still receiving some input in their home language during the preschool day. When thinking about DLLs and their development within an educational context, taking into consideration the home and classroom experiences I just reviewed, it is best to frame our approach within culturally and linguistically appropriate theoretical models. There are several well-known theories of development that I often turn to for help in reminding me that we must study DLLs in a more nuanced way. These include Velas Agosto and colleagues' adaptation of the bioecological model of human development, which centers culture in all ecological systems. Cummins' interdependence model of language development, which reminds us of the underlying metalinguistic knowledge informing bilingual children's school readiness development. And more recently, Ofelia Garcia's translanguaging model, which further highlights the fluidity of language use among DLLs. And finally, Cynthia Garcia-Cole and colleagues' integrative model, which emphasizes the contextual factors we have been discussing thus far. Each of these theories helps us realize the potential for significant variability in development of DLLs in the US. These factors play such an important role in understanding the cognitive and academic skills and educational trajectories of an understudied population. For example, we know that DLLs in the US are more likely to live in poverty and experience low maternal education, which may result in lower academic performance due to systemic issues in education. We also know that DLLs generally have culturally different experiences than the normative population from which developmental competencies and the education system were established. Yet, the limited research that has been done with Spanish-speaking DLLs provides us with some guidance on the development of school readiness skills in general for this population. We know that language is a predictor of long-term academic success and is correlated to literacy, math, executive functioning, and social-emotional skills. For dual language learners, we know that early language and literacy skills transfer across languages, such that DLL children's metalinguistic and metacognitive skills are also important factors we must consider. Most importantly, given the heterogeneity in language inputs and contextual factors experienced by young DLLs in the US, we can no longer treat this group as a homogeneous group. Therefore, the purpose of our current study is to identify varying profiles of Latino DLLs' cognitive, linguistic, literacy, and math skills prior to their entry into kindergarten. Dr. Matthew Foster will now share with you our methods and results. Matthew?
So this study took place as part of a larger project focused on understanding the school readiness of dual language learners in Head Start. All 320 DLLs in the present study were Latino, about 54% were female, and 92% of the children were born in the US. All families reported speaking Spanish as the primary language in the home, and approximately half the children were from families that were from Mexico, with Cuba representing the second largest group. The remaining families immigrated from 9 different Latin American countries. During the spring, prior to each child's kindergarten school year, they were assessed with age-appropriate subtests for language literacy, math, and cognition in English using the Woodcock-Johnson 3 and in Spanish using the Bateria 3. In total, 9 English and 9 Spanish subtests were administered to each child. So we want to emphasize that the English and Spanish measures were administered individually during separate sessions that occurred on separate days by different assessors. And each assessor was instructed to only speak to the child in their assigned language, regardless of their bilingual proficiency. In addition, the language of assessment administration was counterbalanced such that half the children were assessed in English first, and the other half were assessed in Spanish first. So to empirically identify profiles of children based on cognitive, linguistic, literacy, and math skills, we used a series of latent profile analyses. All latent profile analyses utilize W scores from their standardized measures, and all analyses corrected the standard errors of parameter estimates to correct for students being nested within classrooms. So the model fit for the latent profile analyses are displayed above. The BIC continued to decline with the addition of each profile, indicating the appropriateness of adding profiles. Entropy was greater than 0.86 for each profile solution, indicating that on average, each child was correctly classified into a profile. And while the VLMR did not support the addition of a profile following the 2, 3, 4, and 5 profile solutions, the posterior probabilities suggested that each solution correctly estimated children's latent group membership. So we finally looked closely at the estimated means and observed values from each profile solution, and we considered the interpretability of each solution. So as a result, the 4 profile solution was considered the most optimal, theoretically meaningful, and interpretable solution. So displayed above are the norm reference standard scores for English achievement for children in each of the 4 profiles, which included English dominant, balanced average, Spanish dominant, and balanced low. As displayed above, the children in the balanced average profile had the highest scores for English achievement, followed by children in the English dominant profile, which scored higher than children in the Spanish dominant and balanced low profiles, which didn't really differ. In contrast to children's English proficiencies, their Spanish achievement scores were more variable. The Spanish achievement of children in the balanced average and Spanish dominant profiles were similar, but they both tended to outperform children in the English dominant profile, who then tended to outperform children in the balanced low profile. In taking a closer look at the 4 profiles, we see that the majority of the children were English dominant, followed by balanced average, Spanish dominant, and balanced low. And while each profile was similar in their age, the balanced low profile tended to have a larger proportion of boys within it. And on average, again, the children in the balanced average profile tended to outperform children in the other profiles for English achievement, whereas they scored similar to the children in the Spanish dominant profile for Spanish achievement. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Matt. I will now share with you some implications and recommendations from this work. As you can see, there's a great deal of variability in the learner profiles of DLL preschoolers. Labeling them DLLs does not provide you with sufficient information on who they are or their skill set. You might see DLL and assume that the student does not speak English. However, as Matt said, 70% of our sample performed on standard measures as English dominant. Yet, this doesn't mean you should only assess these children or even teach these children only in English. They still have an important set of skills in their home language that must be accounted for. For example, oral comprehension is still often stronger for DLL children in their home language, and oral comprehension is an essential skill for later reading comprehension. It is therefore important to consider measuring oral language skills in both the home language and English when DLLs are present in your sample. Intervention work with DLL should include home language support with curriculum delivery personalized to meet these more specific needs of different DLL learner profiles. We must also be cautious when assessing vocabulary skills in one language, as DLLs appear to have lower vocabulary skills when you only take into account one of their languages. Language is important to accurately measure across both languages because language proficiency is related to other academic skills. We need to be careful to understand that DLL children possess strong metalinguistic and metacognitive skills that support the cross-language transfer of cognitive and academic skills. It is therefore important to understand what DLL children can do in each of their languages and how those skills may serve as strengths within the classroom. Our closing recommendations are to consider the DLLs in your sample as heterogeneous, and whenever possible, evaluate their skills in all of their languages, particularly their language skills, and make informed decisions regarding culturally and linguistically appropriate assessments and interventions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for this session today. I'm Leslie Babinski from Duke University, and I'm presenting today along with my colleague, Steve Amendum from the University of Delaware. We're going to be talking about our work on a teacher professional development program for working with English learners. The focus of today's presentation will be on within group variation among the ELs in our study. We're presenting on behalf of our entire team. The other PIs on the team include Steve Notek from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Marta Sanchez from UNC Wilmington. We know that there's a need for continuing professional learning for classroom teachers who are working with multilingual learners. Without the needed instructional support, children who are learning English as an additional language may experience a persistent gap in reading achievement. Many classroom teachers haven't had the specialized training that they need for working with English learners, and ESL and classroom teachers have limited opportunities for collaboration and may lack a framework for aligning their instruction. With support from IES, we've been developing and testing our teacher professional development program for classroom and ESL teachers to collaborate in working with English learners. We were almost 2 years into 4 years of implementation and data collection when our RCT was suspended due to COVID. For today's presentation, we're sharing some preliminary data, taking a closer look at the diversity of students and parents in our study. We developed the PD program in North Carolina in collaboration with teachers and administrators. Although North Carolina is not one of the top 10 states in terms of the numbers of English learners, like say California or Texas, about 7.5% of North Carolina students receive ESL services. There's also incredible diversity among the EL students in North Carolina, with over 330 different languages spoken at home. Similar to other states, about 75% of EL students in North Carolina speak Spanish at home. There are 23 other states that have between 6 and 10% of public school students qualifying for ESL services. Unlike states with the highest percentage of ELs, many of the states with less than 10% of students identified as ELs don't have requirements for teacher preparation for working with ELs. Many students are provided EL services in pull-out sessions independent of the regular classroom instruction in elementary schools. And as I've mentioned, ESL and classroom teachers may have few opportunities for collaboration. To address this need for ongoing professional opportunities for teachers to learn about working with English learners, our model includes 3 key components: a framework for collaboration between ESL and classroom teachers, high-impact instructional strategies for English learners, and approaches for incorporating Finley's cultural wealth into the classroom. In our study, we work with kindergarten and first grade teachers, along with the ESL teacher at the school. So the teachers participate in the PD as a team. And students who are in their classes and qualify for ESL services at school and speak Spanish at home are eligible to participate in our study. We rely on the district's determination of which students are identified as English learners for the purposes of the study. And North Carolina is one of 41 states and territories that are part of the WIDA consortium and use access testing as part of the criteria for eligibility for ESL services. Each district has a language assistance program for English learners, which outlines test scores and other criteria they use to determine who needs support from the ESL teacher. And districts typically provide 3 levels of language support: comprehensive, or sometimes called intensive, moderate, and transitional. Students who qualify at the comprehensive or moderate levels typically receive direct instruction from the ESL teacher on a regular basis. For students at the transitional level of services, ESL teachers typically provide consultative services to the classroom teacher who can support the English learner, but don't directly work with the English learner in the classroom. Districts also use a home language screener, and students are assessed individually in reading, writing, speaking, and listening to determine their need for ESL services. Here are 2 examples of district criteria for the 3 levels of ESL services in elementary schools. These examples show test cutoff scores at the 3 levels, and you could see that they're a little bit different depending on the district. In addition to test score guidelines, each district's plan also includes other criteria for determining who receives ESL services. These include the child's ability to engage in classroom learning activities and which students need additional scaffolding and modification to participate in instruction. As I mentioned earlier, we've collected 2 cohorts of data for our RCT studying the impact of our PD program on teachers and students. And so far, we've worked with 30 elementary schools in 3 districts with a total of 203 students in kindergarten and 1st grade. At the end of the school year, we also asked parents to complete a survey about their children's school experiences. We asked a series of questions about the home language environment. 131 parents responded to this survey for a response rate of 64%. We asked the parent who responded to this survey what language they typically read and speak. And as you can see in this graph, about 47% of parents said that they spoke only Spanish, while another 28% responded that they spoke more Spanish than English. We also asked who was completing this survey in the home, and we learned that 79% of the respondents were the child's mother, 12% were the child's father, and another 3% of the surveys were completed by the mother and father together. We asked parents what language they typically use when speaking with their child, and in this graph, you could see that 68% of parents said that they spoke only Spanish to their children, and 15% said that they used more Spanish than English. Finally, we asked, when the children in the home speak to one another, what language do they usually use? 39% of parents said that children spoke both English and Spanish to each other equally, and another 24% of parents said that their children speak only English to one another. As you can see from this information, language use at home varies based on how you ask the question and who is doing the speaking and the listening. We also asked if the parent and the child were born in the United States. And as you can see in this graph, 3% of parents said they were born in the US, while 68% of the children in the study were born in the US. We were also interested in learning about the countries, cultures, and backgrounds of the families in the study. And this table shows the parents' responses to the question about their country of birth. As you can see here, 59% of the parents said they were born in Mexico, 22% in Honduras, and 8% in Guatemala. So in our relatively small sample of families who speak Spanish at home, at least 9 different countries and cultures are represented. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Steve, who is going to share some information about students' literacy scores.
So I'm going to tell you about some descriptive analyses of our English learner participants from the efficacy study that Leslie introduced. We'll take a look at 2 questions related to potential variations within our group of EL participants. First, what is the range of early English literacy skills in kindergarten and 1st grade English learners? Second, are there differences in students' baseline skills among districts and/or among schools within districts? Remember from what Leslie just said, we worked in 3 districts, and our outcome measure was MAP Growth K2, which is a computer adaptive assessment that produces an overall RIT score. What you see here are scores for only kindergarten students at school entry. And you'll remember our 2 questions from the previous slide were about the range of literacy skill performance within our group of ELs, and second, whether there were potential differences in baseline skills by district or by school. So first, you can see there was a wide range of scores, and districts had somewhat different patterns based on the range of scores. However, when we examined the means, there was little variance accounted for at the district level. The estimated interclass correlation, or ICC, only accounted for about 1.4% of the variance at the district level. At the school level, the estimated ICC accounted for about 9% of the variance in kindergarten MAP scores. Here you see the analogous plot for baseline first grade MAP literacy scores. And in this plot, again, visually, we can see that at least one district seemed to have a slightly different pattern in terms of the range of first grade MAP scores. However, again, when we examined potential differences in the first grade MAP scores by district and by school, we found no differences with an estimated ICC of 0 at the district level and an estimated ICC of 0.007 at the school level. So from these MAP scores, we concluded that our sample of Spanish-speaking English learners are a highly heterogeneous group based on the wide range of their scores. In addition to MAP growth, we also administered 2 subtests from the Woodcock-Munoz language survey that we gave in Spanish. We administered Spanish vocabulary and Spanish verbal analogies. This slide contains the plot for kindergarten vocabulary subtest that was given in Spanish as an example. Results for the other subtest and grade levels were the same. Here we see that this native language vocabulary subtest showed similar results as the MAP growth test. We see that there's a wide range of student scores, but then when we examined potential differences by district or by school, there was no variance in Spanish vocabulary scores that was accounted for by these levels. So maybe not surprising, even at kindergarten entry, Spanish-speaking ELs had a wide range of vocabulary skills in their native Spanish language. And this demonstrated that even within our narrow definition for our study of Spanish-speaking English learners, ELs are truly a heterogeneous group. So given this wide range of Spanish vocabulary skills in students' native language that we just described, we conclude that it might be important to know more about native language skills of students in order to understand research findings. To consider how native language literacy levels may be important in understanding research findings, I want to give you a quick overview of a different study using ECLSK data that I worked on with my colleague Jackie Relia. This was a separate study from our DCCS efficacy study that we previously discussed, and this study had some longitudinal data. We examined 2 research questions related to native language reading and its relationship with English reading growth across time. First, we investigated the relationship between early Spanish reading skills at school entry and English reading growth from kindergarten through 4th grade. And second, we looked at whether English oral proficiency moderated the potential relationship from the first question. With respect to our first question about the relationship between early Spanish reading skills at school entry and English reading growth from kindergarten through 4th grade, we found a significant relationship for both initial status and for growth over time. On the graph, you see fitted lines for 2 groups. Spanish-speaking bilingual students with higher Spanish reading skills at kindergarten entry are represented by the dark line, And Spanish-speaking bilingual students with lower Spanish reading skills are represented by the gray line. Essentially, students with higher Spanish reading skills at kindergarten entry began school with higher English reading scores, and they made more growth across time in English reading through the end of 4th grade. To examine our second question about whether English oral proficiency moderates this relationship, we created 4 groups. Spanish-speaking bilingual students that had high Spanish reading and high oral English proficiency have the dark solid line on this graph. Those with high Spanish reading and low oral proficiency have the dark dotted line. Students with low Spanish reading and high oral English proficiency have the gray solid line, and those with low Spanish reading and low oral proficiency have the gray dotted line. Results showed moderation for initial status only and not for growth. As you can see, Spanish-speaking bilingual students with high Spanish reading and high oral English proficiency began higher than the other 3 groups. Over time, what really seemed to matter for students, though, was their Spanish reading ability, as both groups that had high Spanish reading made more growth across time. Oral English proficiency did seem to matter, but only for students that had low Spanish reading skills at school entry. Results from studies such as this one suggest that it's vital that we understand and consider native language in research with English learners. To summarize, we see tremendous variation in the group that's often designated as English learners, including how students are classified and how language assistance programs are delivered. Data from our studies show that families come from a variety of cultures, countries, and backgrounds. For example, as Leslie described earlier, families reported 9 different countries of birth in our study. With respect to baseline literacy scores for the group of English learners in our study, we see a wide range of scores with little variance accounted for at the district level. And likewise, we see a similar pattern for native language skills, with a wide range of scores on native language measures and little variance accounted for at the district or school levels. We also note that there are implications for research on practice, and for instruction. With respect to research, we must carefully consider covariates at the district, school, classroom, and individual student levels to include in statistical models to account for important sources of variance. We must also consider subgroups of students, especially given the heterogeneity of English learners in our schools. Subgroup analysis would allow us to determine what works and for whom. In thinking about research on practice and instructional practices, instructional modifications can leverage home language skills to support students' development of English language and literacy. And finally, given the significant heterogeneity of English learners and our work with teachers over the years, we note the high level of teacher expertise required to effectively scaffold instruction for English learners. We would like to thank the many districts, schools, teachers, families, and students that we have worked with over the years. The development of the DCCS Professional Development Program was informed by many, many conversations and implementation efforts with these vital thought partners. If you have questions or would like more information, please see our contact information here.
Well, thank you for those 2 wonderful presentations. This third talk will focus on misclassification risk when using home language surveys to identify English learners. I'd like to acknowledge Adam Wensler and Jimena Franco, who are co-PIs on this project, as well as the contributions of Taylor Simpson, Ashley Beauchamp, and Rosario Villa to the findings that I'll be sharing today. And the information for this presentation comes from our exploration study that is awarded to UNC Chapel Hill. At the beginning of the session, you heard about the pivotal role that home language surveys play in identifying English learners which is a necessary step in determining which students are in need of language support services. And as we discussed, there's no standard home language survey out there. In this talk, what we want to do is center on how there's little guidance on how to ask about multiple languages in the home, as well as the multiple language partners or interlocutors that a student interacts with at home. We know from the literature that home language environments are complex, and you've been hearing about that from the previous two talks. Families are not limited to having one or two adults in the home. And for families of English learners, there's often more than two adults at home, which can result in different patterns of how languages are used, which contributes to the heterogeneity of this population. And in our experience, most HLSs only ask about the language practices of two adults at home. With the knowledge that a third adult may often be present in the home of English learners, is there a risk for misclassifying ELs if the home language survey does not ask about the language contributions of the third adult? And that's the primary question we wanted to address in this presentation. Specifically, we use data from our study to examine if there's a difference in how students' home language is classified when we use information from 3 versus 2 interlocutors. And then for the students whose home language classification changed depending on the number of interlocutors, we wanted to see the ways in which those classifications changed. So how do we look at this? Well, like I said, the data come from our exploration study, and that's a larger study that focuses on the experiences of kindergarten through 3rd grade students who are enrolled in Spanish, English, dual language education programs. The analyses that we'll be sharing have a sample of 406 students who were recruited from 3 public school districts in the southeastern US. For grade level, our sample has greater representation for kindergartners and 1st graders compared to 2nd and 3rd graders. You can see that we're relatively split by gender, and we have pretty good ethnic diversity in the sample. And you'll also notice that this is a pretty educated sample, as noted by having over 50% of parents reporting that they had a college education or higher. For our data collection method, parents completed an HLS at study enrollment. And the HLS questions ask parents to rate the language that a given adult typically uses with a child, and then the language that that child typically uses with an adult. So you can see on the left-hand column, that would be like a typical approach that an HLS would use with 4 questions asking about the 2 interlocutors, whereas the right column shows the addition of the 3rd adult, and that is the approach that we used on our project. The ratings for each question are all on a 5-point scale, ranging from all Spanish to all English, with the midpoint being about equal English and Spanish. Our team developed a scoring program to use the information from the 6 HLS questions to classify students into one of 3 home language groups, mostly Spanish, a mix of Spanish and English, and mostly English. We wanted our scoring program to account for different situations, especially given, like I said, the heterogeneity in the population. So one situation is a pretty straightforward one where there could be no or little variation in the home language. You know, for instance, family might primarily speak Spanish across all the language partners. But we also wanted to account for other situations that could be present in multilingual homes, such as when families might choose like a one parent, one language type of approach, or other families might have a different situation where 2 adults are pretty much using the same language, but that's different from what a 3rd adult, like a grandparent, might be using. And then in other families, there just might not be a very clear majority on what the language is. For our analysis approach, we determined what percentage of our sample had a 3rd interlocutor present based on parent report. And then for all cases, we used our scoring program to determine the home language classification. So we ran the program with data based on 2 interlocutors, and then ran it again, including the information from the 3rd interlocutor. And then finally, we identified cases where the classification changed based on using 2 or 3 interlocutors. Okay, so what did we find? We had information about the presence of a third adult for 402 students, and about 36% of these had a third adult present in the home. When we look descriptively at the classifications using the 2 versus the 3 interlocutors, we see some slight shifts. And these are really kind of thinking about the mostly Spanish category and the mostly English category. You can see that those are slightly higher when we're using information from 2 interlocutors versus 3. And then for the mix of Spanish and English group, you see that that percentage is slightly higher when we use information from 3 adults versus 2. So what you might be wondering is how practically meaningful are these shifts? Well, there were 17 students whose home language group changed when using 2 interlocutors to classify their home language. And that constitutes 4% of our total sample, but it's 12% among those students who have a third adult at home. For these 17 students, there were 10 students where using the 2 interlocutor method underestimated their exposure to Spanish at home. And then we have 7 students where exposure to English was underrepresented. And we want to show you a couple examples. So this first example is where Spanish is underestimated. So these are data from a first grader. And you can see in the purple arrow that we have the interactions between adult number 1 and the child, where the adult is using about an equal amount of English and Spanish and speaking to the child, and then the child is using mostly Spanish and talking to this adult. And then if you look at the column, the arrow over to the right of that with adult 2, that adult is mostly using Spanish with the child, and then the child is using a mix back when talking to that adult. So based on this information, we do see there is a meaningful amount of of English at home, and our program classifies this student as having a home language background that's a mix of Spanish and English. However, when we add a third adult to the mix, we can see that the language interactions between this adult and the child are all in Spanish back and forth. So that adult really does bring in quite a bit of Spanish into the home environment, compared to just relying on the other 2 adults alone, one of whom does bring a lot of Spanish, but the other does bring that mix. So what we would argue here is that it's more appropriate to classify the student as having a mostly Spanish home language background. And here's an example of underestimating English. This is another first grade student. And this looks like a pretty straightforward situation when we're just looking at 2 adults. So, both adults speaking all Spanish to this child, and the child is speaking all Spanish to this child as well. So classification seems pretty easy, that this would be a mostly Spanish home language background. But when we look at what this third adult in this home brings, that person brings all English back and forth with this child. And so our program really places this student as having a more appropriate classification of mix of Spanish and English. So what can we take away from these findings? Although the misclassification rates might seem small, they are high enough to be of concern. One way to think about these findings is to draw a parallel with the documented rates of misclassification for medical diagnoses, and that's at about 5%. So when we look at our sample, our rate of 4% is fairly comparable to that. But if we're just looking at our sample that has that third adult at home, our rate of 12% is more than 2 times as high as the medical misdiagnosis rate. And that's particularly concerning given, like we have been talking about in this entire session, that there's often a third adult present in the home of ELs. Overall, our data draw attention to the need for improving the precision of home language surveys given the critical role that the HLS plays in the sequence of steps to classify a student as an English learner. Previous research shows that students identified as ELs have higher language arts and math outcomes compared with students who are just on the cusp of being identified as an EL. So we're saying that increasing precision may result in identifying students as ELs who might have otherwise been deemed ineligible to receive language services. At the same time, there are other studies that have found negative effects of being classified as an EL on academic achievement. And it'll be important to know if misclassification plays a role in those sorts of patterns. Ultimately, we want students who need language supports to receive them and to avoid situations where there might be students who are receiving language supports but might not need them. Improving classification precision is critical to achieving both of these goals. We'll end with two recommendations. The first is that, as noted at the top of this session, English learners are in everybody's samples. Education researchers should include an HLS in their data collection activities to describe their sample demographics. And second, based on our findings that we shared today, we encourage using HLSs that include 3 interlocutors rather than 2. Not only will this help with increasing precision in researcher sample descriptions, but we also think it'll be helpful to researchers in interpreting their analyses and resulting implications. And lastly, our team wanted to acknowledge all the terrific folks who have been involved in our project, with special thanks to IES and all our partner school district officials, principals, staff, teachers, parents, and students. Here's our contact information in case folks have questions or would like additional information. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Molly Faulkner-Bond for comments on the talks. Thank you. What we'll do for the Q&A portion is we'll have Dr. Molly Faulkner-Bond give her live comments to us. And then after that, we'll start taking any questions or chatting about anything that folks found interesting about the presentations, and I'll explain more about that when Molly's done with her comments. So on to you, Molly.
I think I still have music playing, which I'm realizing is from the other session. Sorry, I was like, can anyone else hear that music that's playing? I still have the whole music on from the presentation. Sorry, let me find my Chrome window. Sorry, folks. All right, sorry about that. So I just want to say this was such a wonderful set of papers. Really appreciated everyone's presentation, and I further appreciate just the invitation to be here and just be a part of this session, and particularly to acknowledge Dory for putting it together. So before addressing the papers, I wanted to share some initial thoughts that I had about just sort of the context for this session and the question that's being asked. I've opted not to use slides today just because I think we're all looking at a lot of slides. I thought it might be nice just to have some in-person presentation. So I'm just going to speak while we're together. But so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Molly Faulkner-Bond, and I actually worked at NCER for several years from 2016 to 2019 as the program officer for the English learner topic. And so a lot of the sort of points that were raised today really resonated with me as things that I just thought a lot about and struggled with, and even worked with and discussed with some of these PIs during my time there. And so just to kind of ground us in what we just saw, this is focused on the importance of identifying English learners in education research. Why should we care about that at all? I think, the baseline is that and as these studies made clear, if you want to study English learners, obviously it's important to know which students are English learners so that you can make sure you're including the right students in your sample. But I think the presentations also made clear that, we have reasons beyond that, understanding who English learners are and also the characteristics of those English learners can affect the validity of our findings, the generalizability of our findings, the interpretations of our findings. And kind of, writ large, it's because English learners are such a diverse population, it really is important for us to try to have a realistic and holistic sense of who these students are when we're including them in research. I also want to flag that I think, these studies, which really are from the English learner topic, seem to have lost my for a second there, obviously are focused on ensuring that we're correctly identifying English learners and doing so in nuanced ways. But I think there's also a broader question across any research topic is, should we be identifying English learners, and if so, how? Something that I saw often at IES that I sometimes found frustrating was that many studies that were not coming into the English learner topic didn't include English learners at all or identify English learners at all in their designs. And there are implications to that exclusion, right? That when we either fail to include English learners in general research studies, I know my video isn't working. I'm not quite sure why. Let me try it again. I'll let you all look at my 1-year-old daughter for a second while I try to troubleshoot and talk at the same time. But so I think a lot of the reasons that people often don't include English learners in their research might stem from in today's presentation. It's complicated. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the group, such that even within the same setting, English learners may differ from one another. Certainly across settings, English learners may differ from one another. So often what happens is because we have this English learner topic, general education researchers may say, well, there's the English learner topic. I'm not applying to that, so I don't need to worry about this population. I would argue that's a huge missed opportunity, and also allows us to sort of conclude that something can be effective when we don't actually know if it's effective for a large portion of the population. So identifying these students is important. Let's see if I can switch cameras here for a moment and then switch back. Sorry for the tech issues, guys. Okay, well, I'll put you on my little screen down here and see if that's any better. Okay, let me get my notes over here. And then finally, so I just want to share a few things that I think came up for often as a program officer that I saw reflected in some of the slides or the presentations today were sort of common challenges in including English learners in research. So I think a big one is just a lack of appropriate measures or the measures we need to measure what we want. And that includes both the constructs that we're measuring. So often we might want to be sort of teaching kids in a much more sort of linguistically rich or culturally responsive way. But then when we look for measures, we have measures of vocabulary, or we have measures of phonics or reading fluency that don't kind of get at those sort of richer language environments we might be trying to create for students. Also, the number of languages needed. So all the studies shared today focused on Spanish-speaking students, but also acknowledged that there was a ton of linguistic diversity in the settings that they were working in. And they pointed out rightly that there are often trade-offs and challenges in terms of, say, translating materials into multiple languages. But so, I'll come back to this at the end, but I think it's important and relevant to think about, are there other ways we can try to include more linguistically diverse students and still get, meaningful and valid measurements for those students in light of those challenges. I think also just the distribution of English learners in schools and programs is something that, again, affects both English learner researchers, but also general education researchers. I suggested more than once and would still be in favor of kind of requiring all IES PIs to include English learners in their clusters when they're doing efficacy research. It would give us at least some information about how these different interventions are affecting English learners. But it can be tricky because English learners are not distributed evenly across schools. They tend to be clustered in certain districts and certain schools, and depending on your sample that you're trying to reach or the settings that you're working in, it may be the case that you truly do not have English learners in all of your schools. And so just thinking about that in terms of where we do research and where that sort of generalizes to. And then again, just the sort of differences in how English learners are identified in different settings can affect generalizability as well. So we know that the exact set of home language survey questions may differ across settings. The assessments used to identify English learners, the thresholds on those assessments can be different. And so, what are the implications of that for the research that we're doing? So I share that just to give a sense of sort of the things that were on my mind as I watched these presentations. And then I was just going to share a few reactions to each of them and maybe some closing thoughts and recommendations. So I think the first paper really surfaced an important issue that I often try to bring up, just the pitfalls of assuming that language plays no role for students who are not identified as English learners. I think what those authors really showed is that even students who were identified as sort of English dominant and had strong English skills were diverse in terms of other languages that they brought to bear, and among students who were Spanish dominant, there were differences. So when we use a sort of binary classification that these students are English learners and these students are not English learners, we're often missing a lot of sort of variation and diversity, which I think came through in the other presentations as well. And particularly for that non-English learner group, I think three groups that we often can be included in there that we may not see if we just go by the label of not an English learner is we could have bilingual students who never were English learners, but who speak multiple languages anyway. We could have students who formerly were English learners. That's less likely in studies like these because I know you guys are all working at younger grade levels, but certainly as you get to higher grade levels, you have more and more former English learners who are included in that non-English learner group. And then one of the most important, I think, is we could have students who never were English learners and maybe who don't even speak a different language at home, but who nonetheless maybe have some language challenges or, still have, language affects their, the way they express themselves, the way they participate in school, and the way they would perform on a measure that we use in a meaningful way. So I often say, we assume that language plays no role for students who are not English learners, but I think, findings like some of the ones in the study show that it really probably does play a role for everyone. And so we ignore that for non-English learners, sometimes to our detriment. I think we could just miss out on really important information. My other monitor is now gone totally blank. And I think I've lost my notes. So I'll just try to speak from memory. So for Leslie and Steve's paper, I think that, first of all, I just want to say, I can't imagine how challenging, I'm sure this actually affected a lot of you, but just having to stop work because of the pandemic. And I know that you guys had some hurricanes before that also got in the way. So really impressed that you had any data at all. But so I think two things that came out, I think just the nature of this intervention, first of all, points out the extent to which educators also may not be equipped to sort of meet English learners and provide them with sort of the supports and instruction that they need and will respond well to. So just the sort of the intervention in and of itself, I think, is sort of pointing to a need. And also something that, if more educators have these kinds of interventions, then I think our ability to develop and test classroom interventions that require teachers to be more skilled at including English learners and scaffolding their involvement would be more feasible to implement if teachers are sort of given those skills. I think obviously your sample demonstrated the diversity we can see even within a small group of students and families and teachers. And so if we imagine scaling that up then across the country, I mean, it's just, there's so much heterogeneity, even within, a relatively small sample. So again, just the sort of the information we lose when we try to label English learners as just one or the other. I think Steve's presentation, particularly of the paper that was not part of the study, so both parts I think were key, just showing, the diversity on one measure, but then the effects of those different types of language. I think it just really, nicely dovetailed with the first paper to show how much we miss in terms of understanding student achievement when we only focus on one language. I think one thing that sort of flagged for both of these two, again, is that, you were able to find these results because you had high quality measures in both languages. And so, for students whose first language is Hmong or Cantonese or, Ethiopian, we're still a long way off from even having that kind of information. Though I think the kinds of analyses that you did and that Matthew did on the first paper really show us at least, that there would be value in trying to get that information for these other language speakers. I will say also for the first paper, I also appreciated the use of latent profile analysis to group the students because I just really liked the use of sort of not coming in with our own assumptions or structures about how we think students should be grouped and really letting the data speak and show us, these are the meaningful ways to group students, because I think that's very much an open question. And so just applaud you guys for doing that. And then I think finally, Dory's paper really, I think, I would say that this study is actionable even from a policy perspective, because as you mentioned, Dory, at the end of your presentation, the main reason that home language surveys are used is to decide which students should even become English learners and be identified for services. And so you've illustrated, I think, very elegantly how those decisions might be affected depending on what we ask. And so if our questions are not sort of responsive to the lived realities of these students, or oversimplify things in ways that maybe weren't even intentional, we can end up sort of making decisions that have very consequential impacts for students' education experiences. So I just thought that was a really creative application, and something that is certainly useful for research in terms of identifying which students belong in a sample, but really have policy implications as well, because this is something that I think educators and system leaders also probably struggle with. How do we decide which students will benefit from these services and won't? So the more information we can get, the better. So in just thinking kind of about this set of papers broadly, I guess one thought that I have that I might kind of put back out to the presenters. I'm a measurement person by training. My PhD is in psychometrics. So another thing that I was always trying to champion at IES is we need more measurement studies. We need more work to develop valid and reliable measures of the things we care about. I do think that more effort to develop high quality measures for English learners would be really helpful, perhaps including maybe some kind of validated home language survey that could work across settings. But I also wonder if it would be fruitful to try to think about what it would be like to develop a measure that captures more of students' full linguistic repertoire without necessarily being like a translated different language measure in Spanish, say. So is there a way that we could develop a measure that would work for many students who speak different languages, but allow them different ways to respond to items using whatever linguistic capital that they have, whatever linguistic strengths and skills that they have? I think we could potentially learn from Universal Design for Learning there, which talks about multiple means of access, multiple means of engagement, just something that allows kids to sort of bring whatever they have, give us the information, and then we can use it to try to get a sense of their English skills, but also whatever their language strengths are in their other language, even if we don't speak that language, and even if they weren't tested in that language. So that's one thing I think about. Another, I just really want to echo, I agree completely with Dory's explicit recommendation, which I think was implicit in the other presentations, of the importance of really just asking questions and collecting information about students' language background. I think it was telling that these studies are all focusing on students in younger grades. I would guess that for studies that are looking at kids in later elementary school and certainly middle and high school, they're probably not bothering to even ask these questions. It's just, is the student an English learner in the system? If so, we count them as an English learner, but I would, maybe there are researchers here who can speak to this, but I don't get the sense that folks are really asking these sort of detailed questions of families about their language use. But I think, again, you've demonstrated the value of that. And this is more a suggestion for IES, but I wonder if there are ways to incentivize all researchers to include English learners in their sample by, for example, offering additional funds for PIs who propose to ensure that their study is fully powered to come up with results specifically for English learners, which could cover additional recruitment costs, perhaps translation of materials or measures. I think there would be great value in that, and it would also probably be incentivizing the right thing. I think PIs would respond to that, and it would acknowledge that sometimes it is challenging to include these students. So I will stop there. I just want to thank Dory again for the invitation, and thank you all for bearing with me through my technology challenges. I apologize, but I think it's a great set of papers, and I look forward to hearing whatever questions and discussion come next.
Thanks so much, Molly, for those great comments, and absolutely no worries on the Zoom challenges. I think we all have been there at some point in the last 2 years. So I can see that there are some questions coming up in the chat. I do want to sort of acknowledge some of the things that Molly has laid out on the table and see if any folks on the panel would like to respond to those from the get-go. And if not, I will be trying to both monitor the chat and look for hands raised regarding questions. So quickly, does anybody from the speaker group want to respond to anything that Molly shared in her thoughts?
Can I jump in? Just on the last comment that Molly made to IES, I would also say that based on some of what we've heard at the opening session, that in addition to including ELs in all studies, we should make sure that there are studies investigators who have good understanding of those languages of the students in their sample, and making sure that they're part of the investigative group, so that we make sure that ELs are included in culturally relevant ways and appropriate ways.
Thanks, Lisa. I also wanted to comment on the extra funds piece, which I see that some people are mentioning in the chat. I'm sure if any of you have been doing any research with English learners, it's expensive. It's like even more expensive, I feel like, if you don't have an EL focus or inclusion in your study. And we really, I mean, I think, you know, Lisa and Leslie's talks really kind of talked about this because they included some assessment data in what they presented, but we really didn't even get into a lot of what's involved in that whole aspect of talking about understanding kids' language capabilities and the cost that is borne out by doing that in a way that is culturally responsive. So anything else that any of the panelists want to share before I start taking some of these questions from the chat?
Adam Winsler here. Hi, everybody. I might just add that another goal that we could do, rather than just getting all studies to include English language learners, is just to make sure that all researchers in education and child development are having good language measures and a good understanding of the bilingual and monolingual sort of backgrounds and exposures. So a couple of recent papers out that are arguing for, even if you don't care about EL at all, every single study needs to have good home language surveys so we can describe our samples and perhaps investigate the language diversity as a factor in whatever we're studying.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, I'm going to try to go through some of these comments. I see there's some back and forth. Doris had a question. I think David also had a comment related to Doris's question about combining Spanish and English proficiency as one factor instead of separating language proficiency. So looks like David has some thoughts on that, but I'm certain, especially seeing who is in the room here, that many people have some thoughts on this. So I think I'll open that up and see if anybody would like to chime in on that question.
Is nobody going to go? I'll go if nobody's going to
Go
go.
for it. I'm good with silence, but go for it.
So I think it really depends on the questions that you're asking and the goal of the information that you want to collect. So sometimes it is important to have an understanding of children's full capacity in each of their languages, to really understand what they're pulling from their different languages as assets in their development of other skills. And other times, I think it's more important to really just understand what they're capable of doing regardless of the language. And so there are some measures that are out there and being developed. I know Liz Pena's group out of UC Irvine, and I don't know if she's in the room. They have some assessments out. And so there are some assessments that are being developed that include both languages. And I really like Molly's suggestion about being able to create assessments that kind of include this idea of translanguaging that I mentioned in my presentation, where children can kind of switch between languages and use their full repertoire of language as part of the assessment. But I think it really depends on what the research question is, or what the goal of the information that you're securing is. So I see valid points for using both, but it really is dependent on what kind of information you're trying to collect and why.
And I think to Lisa's point, I'm sorry, I can't remember which panel this was. It may have been the one yesterday on measurement, measurement approaches. I think it was maybe in early childhood with ELs. But there was conversation about, kind of what is your end goal? If your end goal is to look at children's competencies in the language of instruction, and the language of instruction is English, you're going to look at that differently in terms of how you collect data versus if you're trying to get a sense of bilingual language development, for instance. I'm going to go to the chat. I see some good comments in here about looking at measurement and variance between groups. Alan has a question about, do home language surveys ask which adults talk most or more with the child, like weighting the results depending on how much time the child spends with a given adult? Oh gosh, this is like something that I think folks who have been doing this work is like a bang head here kind of moment. And I know there's other people on this. I think I saw Liz Pena was in this group as well. I'll just kind of say sort of my general takeaway is that this sounds like a really lovely idea in principle, but it's very, very difficult for getting folks to estimate amount of time spent. It doesn't mean it's like a total lost cause, but I think there are other folks who have been spending more time kind of delving deep into this, at least than our team has. I will say for the purposes of like education policy, that is like way down the chain in terms of the kinds of questions that are being asked. But I'd love for any of the other folks, either on the panel or some of the folks on the call who I know have been doing really fabulous work in this area, to weigh in on that.
Maybe one thing I'll throw in, this is not from a research perspective, but from the policy perspective, I think sometimes also the question can be framed in a way of like among adults that the child spends a certain amount of time with. Like you could ask the question in a way that tries to get at the amount of exposure the child has. Sometimes they'll even ask, like, in addition to the household, are there other places where the child might have, use or be exposed to other languages? And so you could perhaps build that into the question so that it's sort of assumed that if they say yes to this, or if they say mostly to this, it's suggesting a certain degree of use and exposure that is worth including in the weighting.
Thanks. Other comments?
I saw a comment about somebody being a roommate. I think making sure that when you're asking these questions to parents, it's about the presence in their child's lives. How many adults live in a home, and try to get a sense of who these adults are. And I think that's important in understanding the different language dynamics that might occur. In addition to adults, there's older siblings, there might even be adult siblings that live in the home. And so getting a better sense, without being too intrusive, I guess, of who these people are and what kind of relationship would they have with the child is important. I know previous work used to try to calculate percentages, and that was never very reliable. And so it's a tricky thing to measure, but just getting a sense of, is this a roommate, or is this a grandparent or an aunt that lives with them? And we know that there's a lot of multi-generational homes, but we can't assume that that's the case. And so I think being more intentional in the questions that you ask in order to be able to understand this language dynamic is important. I saw also in the chat, Howard Goldstein was talking about like some sort of Lena type algorithm to get a sense of who's talking what in the home. And yesterday or the day before, there was a sensing technologies session that was really neat, that looked at UbaSense and Lena together and trying to get a sense of what's going on in the classroom with children, and which was fascinating. And it might be a bit intrusive to do that in the home, but even just getting a sense of who's in the home and how often they're in the home. And although that could be very sensitive depending on the population that you're working with. Just some thoughts.
And Liz also shared a comment, which Liz, if you're willing, I'd love to hear you expound on this a little bit, just because of the population you do work with. thinking about it from like a speech language perspective, when we really want to think about intersectionality, which just all the more illustrates the heterogeneity in the population. So if you're silent, I will assume that you just would rather pass, and that's cool. We can move on to somebody else, but I'll stop for a second.
I'm here. I came to learn from you, not to jump in. So but it's complicated. And so, yeah, we try to separate out proficiency and exposure because those are different indices. And then the measure that what we're doing also matters, right? So we often see these profiles of mixed dominance. So on semantics, we might see kids doing better in English, but in morphosyntax, which is a hallmark of language impairment, we might see better performance in their home language. So it also takes time. Kids don't jump into dominance in one language across all their domains because it's developmental. So I think that's what makes it that's what's given me a 25-year career in this, because it's complicated. But I don't know that we have good answers, but I did stick a link to a paper that has some really cool figures showing like the interactions between age and age of exposure and then level of proficiency across different kinds of tasks.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, I'm looking to see, I think we may have tapped all the questions in the chat. Other questions that folks might have?
I'm curious, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but are there any researchers in the room who are studying English learners in older grades? And I'm just curious, do you feel like it would be feasible to collect this kind of, rich language about home language? Are you collecting it? I'm just sort of curious how much this happens, kind of beyond the very early grades.
So I'm currently working with 19 districts in the United States with middle schoolers, and our English learners are considered priority students for this study. And we have a lot of work to get done. I will not even venture into say it will be difficult or easy to collect. I just think we need to be aligned across school districts. Everybody collects home language in different ways, and forget about proficiency. We wanted to get information about proficiency and nobody's doing that, not even on the upper grades. So there's a lot of work to get done.
Thanks, Jimena. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I'll jump in. We're starting to collect, I started writing this, but it's faster to say it. We're starting to collect data on like middle school kids, and we only have like 125, so it's a really small sample, but this is where we have lots of disconnection. So we ask hour by hour. So what time does your child get up? Who are they with? What language do they speak to the child? And what language does the child speak? So we ask this for a typical day, typical weekend. We ask teachers and parents to get like this index of exposure. This is where we have lots of disconnects where kids are speaking English to their parents, but the parents are speaking Spanish to them. And it shows up in really interesting ways in their performance. So they look bilingual and but the degree to which they can do things in each language varies quite a lot. It's interesting, but I don't know what the answer is.
But Liz, we're seeing the same thing with our preschoolers. So with one of the papers I presented in a presentation, just the different language dynamics in the different homes. So even though the parents are mostly speaking Spanish to the children, even at 4 and 5 years old, you have a lot of kids who are, as soon as the parents start speaking a little bit of English, then it opens up the floodgates for the children to start speaking only English. And so we see that as early as 3 and 4. I can only imagine once you get to the middle school ages, right? it's very complex.
And another thing that adds to that complexity is, the home language survey is asking about language and sort of the linguistic characteristics that you would be considered characteristic of how people talk in their house. And, we hear a lot about sort of that distinction between academic language and not academic language, and kind of thinking about, layering that on top of this conversation. I did see a comment in the chat from Sarah. Given the heterogeneity of DLLs that all the studies showed, do we think we need to consider both or all of the child's languages in determining who needs what kinds of ESL support? For example, might students who have lower skills in both their home language and English need different support than those who have higher skills in their home language? So I would think the answer should be yes to that. And I think this is one thing where Lisa and team's work has really kind of helped illustrate that a little bit. And then thinking about the match and some of the things that Leslie shared. If you even just think about it conceptually, which is a very kind of rough way of thinking about sort of 4 quadrants, where you would have like high in both, low in both, and then a combination of high and low, one language versus the other. But that's really oversimplifying the story. And so, I think that's sort of the beauty of looking at some of these kind of data-driven approaches to elaborate further. So I don't know if Lisa and team want to pick that up.
Sure, because I haven't talked enough in this session. So I think I don't even like the idea of ESL. I feel like children should be, I guess, going into more of the MTSS framework. Children should be getting interventions and instruction, and even having the curriculum meet their specific needs. We're seeing that there's a lot of diversity, right? So even if they're DLL, so putting them in an ESL classroom and lumping all of those kids in our study into the same intervention or the same curriculum doesn't make a lot of sense based on the skills that we're seeing. Definitely think that home language is important part of language instruction for all of the children, even the children who were in that English dominant quadrant. You can see that some of their oral comprehension skills were still stronger in Spanish. And so that's going to impact their reading comprehension skills when they get into middle elementary grades. But I think it's really a matter of what's working best in terms of interventions for these different groups, and how can we train teachers to really meet these children where they are and use their assets to help them develop their skills in other areas. For that low group, those are the ones I'm really concerned about, and I feel like need further evaluation, because it may be that they have some underlying, but I know her group's done some of that. But it's those are the kids that I'm not concerned about any of the other ones, because they're showing proficiency, high proficiency in at least one of their languages, if not both. And it's those children that are low that seem to have some sort of underlying either metacognitive or metalinguistic issues that need to be addressed in order to help those children to be successful.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lisa, on that. And it just reminds me of how complex the teacher's job is. We're thinking about how complex it is to measure children's language proficiency in English and their home language, and maybe a third language even, and just how sophisticated teachers need to be in understanding the different strengths that students bring to the classroom, and how they can align and modify their instruction to make sure students are benefiting from that instruction, almost regardless of whether or not the student is primarily in a regular classroom setting or also works with an ESL teacher. I think there's a tremendous amount we could do in terms of policy and practice to support educators in developing the skills they need to respond to the students in their classroom. And it's really a high level of sophistication and skill to be able to do that, given all of our discussion about how hard it is to even measure it. So I just want to bring us back to the big job that teachers have ahead of them as well.
Thanks so much for that, Leslie. And I think that's a good point to end on. I'm sorry we did not get to all the questions in the chat. I love seeing these really good issues that people are bringing up, but we are at our time. And I really want to thank all of you for joining us today, and special thanks to everybody who served on the panel and contributed to these studies. I do hope to see all of you at our closing plenary that will be starting in 15 minutes. Thanks, everybody.